truck bounced over frozen mud as Liesl Moravec pressed her face against the wooden slats, watching the pine trees blur past like dark ghosts. Her breath came out in silver clouds, and her fingers, numb from the December cold, clutched a folded letter that promised everything she had prayed for. The German officer who had handed her this letter smiled with teeth too white, eyes too kind. He said the word that made her heart stop: safety. She was 25 years old, a Jewish schoolteacher from the small Czech village of Jar, and for 3 years she had hidden in root cellars and barn lofts while the world burned around her. Now finally, someone was taking her away from the nightmare. The truck held 17 other women, all of them clutching similar letters, all of them crying tears of relief. Liesl looked at their faces, hollow cheeks, cracked lips, eyes that had seen too much, and she felt something she hadn't felt in years: hope. She didn't notice that the truck was heading east, not west. She didn't notice that the driver never stopped at checkpoints. She didn't notice that the officer's smile never reached his eyes. The woman beside her was named Ruzhena, a baker's daughter from Prague with red hair that had turned brittle and grey from malnutrition. Ruzhena held Liesl's hand and whispered about the future. "They're taking us to Switzerland," she said, her voice cracking with joy. "My cousin wrote to me. There are houses there with warm beds and soup every day. Real soup, Liesl, with meat." Liesl wanted to believe her. She needed to believe her. For 3 years, she had survived on scraps stolen from pig troughs, on rainwater collected in rusted cans, on the kindness of farmers who risked their lives to hide her in spaces no larger than coffins. Her mother had been taken in the first roundup. Her father had been shot trying to protect her younger brother. Her brother, sweet Tomasz, who loved to draw horses, had vanished into a train that never came back. She was the last Moravec alive, and she had promised herself she would survive, not for revenge, not for justice, but because someone had to remember them. Someone had to carry their names into the future. The truck turned down a narrow road lined with birch trees, their white bark glowing like bones in the winter light. Liesl closed her eyes and let herself dream. She dreamed of a classroom filled with children who had never known war. She dreamed of chalk dust on her fingers, of multiplication tables written on blackboards, of the sweet sound of young voices reading poetry aloud. She dreamed of a small house with a garden where tomatoes grew fat and red in the summer sun. She dreamed of a man who would love her gently, who would kiss the scar on her shoulder from the night the soldiers came, who would hold her when the nightmares woke her screaming. She dreamed of growing old, of grey hair and wrinkled hands, of grandchildren who would never understand why their grandmother flinched at loud noises. These dreams kept her alive. These dreams made her human. But dreams, like promises, can be broken. And the road they travelled was not leading to Switzerland. It was leading somewhere much darker, somewhere the maps didn't show, somewhere that would haunt the world for generations. The truck slowed, and through the wooden slats, Liesl saw the outline of a building rising from the frozen earth like a wound that refused to heal. The officer appeared at the back of the truck, his boots crunching on the icy ground. "Ladies," he announced, in perfect Czech, "welcome to your new beginning." His voice was warm, almost fatherly, and Liesl felt her shoulders relax. She had been so afraid, so certain that something was wrong, but his kindness proved that her fears were foolish. The women climbed down from the truck, their legs stiff and trembling from hours of sitting on wooden benches. Liesel looked around. The building was large and grey, surrounded by tall fences topped with wire that glinted in the pale sunlight. Guards stood at regular intervals, their rifles slung over their shoulders, their faces expressionless. But there were flowers, dried and dead from winter, planted along the pathway. There were curtains in the windows, blue and white like the sky on a summer day. There was even a sign above the main door, painted in cheerful yellow letters that read, Arbeit macht frei. Work makes you free. Liesel didn't know what those words meant. She didn't know that she was standing at the gates of the Ravensbrück concentration camp. She didn't know that the officer's kindness was a performance rehearsed 1,000 times on 1,000 women. She only knew that she was tired, so tired, and that someone had finally come to save her. Ruzena squeezed her hand. See, she whispered, I told you. Everything will be fine now. Liesel nodded and followed the other women through the gates. The heavy metal doors closed behind them with a sound like thunder, and for a moment, just a moment, Liesel felt a chill run down her spine. It was the same chill she had felt the night her father was killed, the same chill she had felt when she heard the trains leaving Prague for destinations unknown. But she pushed the feeling away. She had to believe, she had to hope, because without hope, she was already dead. Inside the building, female guards in grey uniforms waited with clipboards and measured smiles. Leave your belongings here, one of them instructed. You'll get new clothes, new identification, new everything. Your old life is over. Your new life begins today. Liesel set down her small bag, the only thing she owned in the world, and walked toward the processing room. She didn't look back. She didn't see the guard kick her bag into a pile with hundreds of others. She didn't see the officer remove his smile like a mask and toss it into the cold wind. She thought she was walking toward safety, but every step brought her closer to her own grave. 3 years earlier, Liesel Moravec stood at the front of her classroom in Jar, pointing at a map of Europe with a wooden stick. 23 children sat before her, their eyes bright with curiosity, their notebooks open and ready. Can anyone tell me the capital of France? She asked, and 23 hands shot into the air. She was 22 years old then, the youngest teacher in the village, with dark hair that fell past her shoulders and eyes the color of autumn leaves. The children adored her because she made learning feel like adventure. She told them stories about ancient Rome, about Egyptian pyramids, about explorers who sailed across oceans to discover new worlds. She taught them that knowledge was power, that books were weapons against ignorance, that every child, no matter how poor or small, could change the world. She believed these things with her whole heart. She believed that education could defeat darkness. She didn't know that darkness was already coming for her, riding on the backs of tanks and the wings of bombers, carrying lists of names that included her own. Her father, Joseph Moravec, ran a small printing press in the back of their house. He printed prayer books and poetry collections, wedding invitations, and funeral announcements. He was a quiet man with gentle hands and a voice that never rose above a whisper. Her mother, Hannah, taught piano to the children of wealthy families in nearby towns, riding her bicycle down country roads with sheet music strapped to her back. Her brother Tomasz was only 16, an artist who spent his days sketching the horses that grazed in the fields beyond the village. They were not wealthy, but they were happy. They ate dinner together every evening. The four of them crowded around a small wooden table, sharing bread and stories and laughter. Joseph would read aloud from the newspaper while Hannah hummed melodies and Tomasz showed them his latest drawings. Liesel would tell them about her students, about their questions and discoveries, about the little boy who finally learned to read and cried with joy. These were ordinary evenings. These were precious evenings. These were the evenings that would haunt Liesel in the darkness of the camp, shining like distant stars she could never reach again. The first soldiers arrived in March of 1939, when the snow was just beginning to melt and the crocuses were pushing through the frozen earth. Liesel was walking to school when she heard the rumble of engines, and she stopped in the middle of the road to watch the convoy pass. German trucks, German flags, German voices shouting commands in a language she barely understood. The villagers stood in doorways and behind curtains, watching in silence, their faces pale with fear. Liesel's principal, an elderly man named Dr. Horak, met her at the school entrance. His hands were shaking. "Go home, Liesel," he said. "School is closed until further notice." She didn't understand. She asked why, asked what was happening, asked when she could return to her classroom. Dr. Horak looked at her with eyes that held 1,000 years of sorrow. "You're Jewish, Liesel. From now on, that's the only thing that matters." She walked home in a daze, passing soldiers who laughed at jokes she couldn't hear, passing neighbors who looked away when she tried to meet their eyes. Something had changed in the world. Something had broken, and nothing would ever be the same again. Within weeks, the new laws began. Jews could not own businesses. Jews could not teach in schools. Jews could not walk on certain streets, shop in certain stores, ride on certain trains. Joseph's printing press was confiscated by a German officer who didn't even look him in the eye. Hannah's piano students stopped coming, their parents too afraid to associate with a Jewish family. Tomasz was expelled from his art classes, and Liesel, brilliant, dedicated Liesel, was forbidden from ever entering a classroom again. She sat at home, staring at the walls, while her world collapsed around her. Her mother tried to stay positive, cooking their favorite meals with whatever scraps she could find, playing music on the old piano that no one had taken yet. Her father disappeared into himself, spending hours in his empty workshop, staring at the printing press that no longer belonged to him. Tomasz stopped drawing horses. He stopped drawing anything at all. The light went out of his eyes, and Liesel didn't know how to bring it back. She held her family together with sheer willpower, with forced smiles and whispered prayers, with the desperate belief that this too would pass. But the darkness only deepened. The roundup came on a cold October night in 1941. Liesel was asleep when the pounding started on their door, and she woke to her mother's screams and her father's voice, calm and steady, saying, "Take what you can carry. We have 2 minutes." She grabbed a small bag and filled it with photographs. Her parents on their wedding day, Tomasz as a baby, her grandmother, who had died before the war. She grabbed her journal, filled with lesson plans she would never teach and poems she had written in the margins. She grabbed her mother's silver hairbrush, the one that had belonged to 3 generations of Moravec women. And then the soldiers were inside, shouting, pushing, forcing them into the street where other Jewish families were already waiting, their breath visible in the cold air, their children crying in confusion. That night, Liesel watched her father die. He stepped in front of a soldier who was hitting Tomasz, and the soldier shot him without hesitation. Josef Moravec fell into the mud, his gentle eyes staring at the sky, his gentle hands reaching for his son, one last time. Liesel didn't scream. She didn't cry. She took Tomasz's hand and walked forward, leaving her father's body in the street where he had lived his entire life. She couldn't save him, but she could still save her brother. Or so she thought. Liesel and her mother and brother were loaded onto a truck with 40 other people, packed so tightly that no one could sit down. The truck drove for hours through the night, stopping at checkpoints where soldiers shined flashlights into their faces and counted them like cattle. Tomasz pressed his face against Liesel's shoulder and sobbed silently, his thin body shaking with grief. Hannah stared straight ahead, her eyes empty, her lips moving in prayers that no one could hear. Liesel held them both, her arms aching from the effort, her heart breaking with every mile they traveled. She didn't know where they were going. She didn't know what would happen when they arrived. She only knew that she had to keep her family alive, had to find a way to escape, had to believe that somewhere in this nightmare there was still a path to morning. When the truck finally stopped, they were at a train station she didn't recognize. The platform was crowded with hundreds of people, men, women, children, elderly, all wearing the yellow stars that marked them for destruction. Soldiers herded them toward the trains with rifles and dogs, shouting commands that blurred into meaningless noise. This was the moment Liesel had been dreading. This was the moment that would define the rest of her life. She saw the gap in the fence before anyone else did. It was small, barely visible in the darkness, hidden behind a pile of wooden crates. A child could fit through it easily. An adult would have to squeeze, would have to leave behind everything they carried, would have to run faster than they had ever run before. Liesel looked at her mother. Hannah was too weak, too broken by grief and exhaustion to run. She would never make it through that gap. But Tomasz could. Tomasz was young and thin and still had the strength to survive. Liesel grabbed her brother's arm and pulled him close. "Do you see that fence?" she whispered. "When I say run, you go through that gap and you don't stop. You run until you find a farmer, a church, anyone who will hide you. Do you understand?" Tomasz shook his head, tears streaming down his face. "I won't leave you. I won't leave Mama." Liesel wanted to cry. She wanted to hold him and promise that everything would be fine. But she didn't have time for comfort. She only had time for survival. "Tomasz, listen to me. Papa is gone. If we get on that train, we might never come back. But if you run, if you hide, if you survive, then our family survives. You carry us with you. You carry our names into the future. Do you understand?" He understood. She could see it in his eyes, the terrible understanding that this was goodbye. Hannah reached out and touched her son's face, her fingers trembling. "Go, my darling," she whispered. "Live for all of us." And then Liesel pushed him toward the fence, and Tomasz ran, his thin legs pumping, his dark hair flying behind him, his heart breaking with every step. A soldier shouted, raised his rifle, fired into the darkness. Liesel screamed her brother's name, but the crowd surged forward, and she lost sight of him. She never found out if he made it through the gap. She never found out if he found a farmer or a church or anyone who would hide him. She searched for him in every face she saw, listened for his name in every whisper, prayed for him in every moment of darkness. But Tomáš Moravec vanished from the world that night, leaving only a sister who would carry his drawings in her memory, and a mother who would never speak again. Hannah died on the train 3 days later, her body giving up what her spirit had already lost. Liesel held her mother's cold hand and promised her that she would survive. She would survive for all of them. She would survive or die trying. For the next 2 years, Liesel lived like a ghost. She escaped from the train during a stop in a small Polish town, crawling through a hole in the floor that someone else had already cut. She ran through frozen fields, hiding in haystacks and abandoned barns, eating raw potatoes stolen from root cellars and drinking water from streams. She found farmers who risked their lives to hide her in secret rooms, behind bookshelves, in cellars beneath pig stalls, in attics so small she could not stand. She learned to move at night, to trust no one, to read the danger in a stranger's eyes before they spoke a word. She watched villages burn. She heard gunshots in the distance that meant someone else had been caught. She survived typhus that nearly killed her, burning with fever in a barn while a farmer's wife fed her soup and wiped her forehead with cold cloths. She survived a German patrol that came within 10 feet of her hiding place, their boots visible through the cracks in the floorboards, their dogs sniffing at the door. She survived because she refused to die. She survived because somewhere, maybe, Tomáš was still alive, still carrying their families' names into the future. And someone had to find him. Someone had to bring him home. The letter arrived in December of 1944, delivered by a woman who claimed to work for the resistance. It was typed on official German paper, signed by an officer whose name Liesel didn't recognize. It said that Jewish refugees were being transported to Switzerland, where they would receive food, shelter, and medical care. It said that Liesel Moravec had been selected for this transport because of her education and her skills. It said that a truck would arrive in 3 days to take her to safety. The woman smiled kindly and pressed the letter into Liesel's hands. "You've suffered enough," she said. "It's time for you to rest." Liesel wanted to be suspicious. She wanted to question the letter, the woman, the entire story. But she was so tired, so hungry, so alone. She had been hiding for 3 years, and every day felt like a war. The letter promised an end to that war. The letter promised peace. And Liesel, desperate, exhausted, hopeful Liesel, believed it. She didn't know that the woman worked for the Nazis. She didn't know that the letter was a lie designed to lure Jews out of hiding. She didn't know that she was walking into a trap that had already claimed thousands of lives. She only knew that someone was finally coming to save her, and she was so ready to be saved. Ravensbrück rose from the German countryside like a fortress built for nightmares. Liesel's first impression was the smell, a thick, sour odor that seemed to seep into her skin and settle in her bones. The second was the sound, the constant barking of dogs, the shouting of guards, the shuffle of thousands of feet moving in unison. And the third was the sight of the women. They wore striped uniforms that hung from their skeletal frames. Their heads were shaved, their eyes hollow, their movements mechanical. They walked in straight lines, carrying heavy stones or pushing carts filled with rubble. their bodies bent under the weight of labor that served no purpose except destruction. Liesel's heart stopped. This was not Switzerland. This was not safety. This was a place where human beings were turned into machines and then broken down for parts. She tried to turn back, tried to run toward the gates, but guards were everywhere, their rifles raised, their dogs straining at their leashes. There was no escape. There had never been any escape. The letter, the truck, the kind officer. It was all a performance, a carefully designed trap to catch the Jews who had managed to survive the first waves of deportation. And Liesel had walked right into it. The processing took hours. Liesel was stripped of her clothes, her hair, her name. A guard tattooed a number on her forearm, 47,293, and told her that this was her identity now. She was given a striped uniform that smelled like death, a pair of wooden shoes that rubbed her feet raw, and a tin bowl for food that would rarely come. She was assigned to Block 12, a wooden barracks packed with 400 women who slept on bunks stacked 3 high, their bodies pressed together for warmth, their breath forming clouds in the freezing air. The woman in the bunk beside her was named Marta, a Polish doctor who had been in the camp for 2 years. Marta's eyes were dead, but her hands were steady, and she examined Liesel's tattoo with clinical detachment. "You're healthy," she said. "That's good. The healthy ones last longer." Liesel wanted to ask how long, wanted to know what happened to the women who weren't healthy. But she was afraid of the answer. Instead, she asked about the showers, the medical facilities, the promise of work that would set them free. Marta laughed, a terrible, empty sound that echoed through the barracks. "There are no showers," she said. "There is no freedom. There is only this. And when they're done with us, there's the crematorium." Liesel learned the rules quickly. Wake before dawn. Stand for roll call that lasted hours, regardless of rain or snow or ice. March to work assignments that ranged from construction to sewing to medical experiments that left women screaming in the night. Eat whatever thin soup was provided, mostly water with occasional vegetables that had rotted days before. Sleep in 4-hour shifts, always listening for the guard's boots, always ready to stand at attention at a moment's notice. Never look a guard in the eye. Never speak unless spoken to. Never cry, never complain, never show weakness. The women who showed weakness disappeared. Liesel saw it happen on her 3rd day. A young girl, no older than 17, collapsed during roll call, her body too weak to stand any longer. The guards dragged her away, while her mother screamed and clawed at their uniforms, begging them to let her daughter rest. They shot the mother first, then the daughter. Their bodies lay in the snow for 3 hours, while the other women stood motionless, their eyes fixed straight ahead, their hearts dying inside their chests. Liesel learned to feel nothing. She learned to be invisible. She learned to survive 1 hour at a time. But survival in Ravensbrück was not just about avoiding death. It was about maintaining something human in a place designed to destroy humanity. Liesel found her purpose in the younger women, the ones who had arrived with hope still flickering in their eyes. She gathered them in the bunks at night and whispered lessons to them in the darkness. Mathematics, history, poetry, science. She taught them the capitals of countries they might never see, the names of rivers that flowed to oceans they might never touch. She taught them to count in languages they had never heard, to recite poems that had survived centuries of darkness, to believe that knowledge was a form of resistance. "They can take everything from us," she whispered, "but they cannot take what lives in our minds. They cannot burn the books we carry in our memories. They cannot silence the voices of everyone who came before us." The women listened, their hollow eyes gradually filling with something that looked almost like light. It wasn't hope. Hope was too dangerous in a place like this, but it was something close. It was the refusal to become what the camp wanted them to become. It was the insistence on remaining human, even when humanity seemed like a distant memory from another world. 6 months passed. Liesel survived typhus again. She survived a beating from a guard who caught her teaching mathematics to a group of Dutch girls. She survived the death of Marta, who walked into the electric fence one morning without a word of goodbye. She survived the winter, the hunger, the endless days of labor that wore her body down to bones and sinew. And then, in June of 1945, something changed. The guards became nervous, whispering to each other in corners, glancing toward the horizon as if expecting something they couldn't name. Roll calls became shorter. Work assignments became less brutal. And rumors began to spread through the barracks, rumors of Allied forces approaching, of German armies retreating, of liberation that might finally be coming. Liesel didn't dare to believe. She had believed the letter, and the letter had brought her here. She had believed in safety, and safety had been a lie. But she listened to the rumors, and she watched the guards, and she felt something stirring in her chest that she had forgotten existed. It was hope, dangerous, foolish, stubborn hope. And despite everything, she couldn't make it go away. The word spread through Block 12 like wildfire. Selection. Liesel had been in the camp long enough to know what that meant. Every few weeks, the guards gathered the prisoners for inspection. They looked at teeth, at muscles, at the will to live that showed in a woman's eyes. The strong were sent back to work. The weak were sent to the crematorium. It was efficient. It was merciless. It was happening tomorrow at dawn. Liesel lay in her bunk that night, listening to the breathing of 400 women, wondering how many of them would still be breathing tomorrow. She was thin, thinner than she had ever been, but she could still work. Her hands were calloused from months of hard labor. Her feet were scarred from the wooden shoes, but her body still moved when she commanded it. She would survive the selection. She had to survive the selection. But the girl in the bunk below her, a 15-year-old named Eva who reminded Liesel painfully of Tomasz, was not strong enough. Eva had stopped eating 3 days ago. Her fever had not broken. Her eyes stared at the ceiling without seeing, and her lips moved in prayers that no one could hear. "You have to eat," Liesel whispered, climbing down to sit beside the girl. "The selection is tomorrow. You have to be strong enough to stand." Eva shook her head weakly. "I don't want to stand," she said. "I don't want to work. I don't want to live." Liesel felt her heart crack. She had heard these words before, from women who had given up, from women who walked into the fence, from women who simply stopped breathing in the night. She had learned to harden herself against them, to focus on her own survival, to accept that she could not save everyone. But Ava's face was Tomasz's face. Ava's voice was Tomasz's voice. And Liesel could not walk away. "Listen to me," she said, taking the girl's cold hand in her own. "I know you want to give up. I know it feels like there's nothing left to live for. But the war is ending. The rumors are true. I can see it in the guard's eyes. If you can survive one more day, one more week, you might see your family again. You might see your home again. Don't you want that? Eva's eyes filled with tears. My family is dead. They killed them in Auschwitz. My mother, my father, my little brothers. I'm the only one left. Liesel held Eva close, feeling the girl's bones through her thin uniform, feeling the fever burning beneath her skin. Then you have to live for them, she whispered. You have to carry their names into the future, just like I carry my father's name, my mother's name, my brother's name. We are the survivors, Eva. We are the ones who will remember. And if we die here, they win. They erase us from history. They pretend we never existed. Is that what you want? Eva was silent for a long moment. Then, slowly, she reached for the soup that Liesel had saved from her own dinner, a thin, watery broth that was barely enough to sustain a mouse. She drank it in small sips, her hands trembling, her eyes never leaving Liesel's face. Tell me a story, she whispered. Tell me about the world outside this place. And Liesel did. She told Eva about the classroom in Jar, about the 23 children with their bright eyes and open notebooks. She told her about the map of Europe on the wall, about the capitals of countries that still existed somewhere beyond the electric fences. She told her about Paris and London and New York, about museums filled with paintings and libraries filled with books, about oceans that stretched to the horizon and mountains that touched the sky. She painted a world that seemed impossible from inside the camp, a world of beauty and freedom and light. And Eva listened and drank her soup, and for the first time in days, closed her eyes in peaceful sleep. The selection began at dawn. The guards lined up the prisoners in the yard, their breath visible in the cold morning air, their bodies shivering in the thin striped uniforms. A man in a white coat walked down the rows, pointing left or right with a gloved finger. Left meant work, right meant death. The process was quick, efficient, without hesitation. Liesel stood in the third row, her spine straight, her eyes forward, her heart pounding so loud she was sure the guards could hear it. She watched the man approach, watched his cold eyes scan the women around her, watched his finger point left, left, right, left, right, right. 3 women were pulled from the line and marched toward the trucks that waited beyond the gate. They didn't scream. They didn't fight. They walked in silence, their dignity the last thing they possessed. The man stopped in front of Liesel. His eyes examined her face, her arms, her hands. He looked at her teeth, at her posture, at the strength that still burned behind her eyes. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then his finger pointed left, and Liesel exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She would live another day. But Eva was not so lucky. The girl stood 2 rows behind Liesel, her body swaying, her face pale with fever. The man took one look at her and pointed right. Guards moved forward to grab her arms, but Eva didn't resist. She turned her head and found Liesel's eyes across the yard, and she smiled, a small, peaceful smile that said everything words could not. "Remember me," she mouthed. "Tell them my name." The guards dragged her away, and Liesel stood frozen, her fists clenched, her nails drawing blood from her palms. She wanted to scream, to fight, to throw herself at the guards and die alongside this girl who had become her purpose. But she didn't move. She couldn't move. Because if she died here, there would be no one left to tell Eva's story, no one left to carry her name into the future. No one left to prove that she had existed, that she had mattered, that she had been loved. So Liesel stood in the yard and watched the truck drive away, and she carved Eva's name into her heart, alongside her father's, her mother's, her brother's. She was running out of room, but she would not stop collecting names. She would carry them all, every single one, until the day she finally set them free. Dr. Karl Richter arrived at Ravensbrück in February of 1945, when the snow was 3 feet deep and the prisoners were dying faster than the crematorium could burn them. He was 40 years old, with silver hair and kind eyes that seemed wildly out of place in a camp built for cruelty. The rumors said he was different from the other doctors, that he healed instead of harmed, that he saved lives instead of ending them, that he had connections that could get prisoners transferred to safer camps. The rumors also said he was looking for an assistant, someone educated, someone who could take notes and organize records. Liesel heard the rumors and felt something stir in her chest. That dangerous hope again, that stubborn belief that maybe, just maybe, there was still a way out. She volunteered for the position without knowing what it would require. She walked into Dr. Richter's office with her number tattooed on her arm and her heart beating in her throat. He looked up from his desk and studied her with those kind eyes, and for a moment, she forgot she was a prisoner. For a moment, she felt human again. "You were a teacher," he said. It wasn't a question. Liesel nodded, not trusting her voice. He gestured to a chair across from his desk, a real chair with cushions, the first she'd sat in since arriving at the camp. "I've read your file. You speak 4 languages. You have a degree in literature. You were considered one of the best educators in your region before the war." He paused, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. "I need someone intelligent, someone who can keep records, organize supplies, assist with medical procedures, someone who can follow orders without asking questions." Liesel swallowed. "I can do that." Dr. Richter smiled, and the warmth of it almost made her cry. "I'm sure you can, but there's something else I need, something more important." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I need someone who can keep a secret. Can you do that, prisoner 47, 293? Can you keep a secret that could get us both killed?" Liesel didn't hesitate. "Yes," she said. And in that moment, everything changed. The secret was simple. Dr. Richter was not what he appeared to be. He wore the uniform of a Nazi doctor, but beneath that uniform beat the heart of a man who had watched his own wife die in Auschwitz. He had been forced to join the medical corps when the SS discovered he was one of the best surgeons in Germany, and he had spent 3 years playing a role that sickened him to his core. But he had also spent those 3 years saving lives, quietly, carefully, one prisoner at a time. He falsified death records for women who were scheduled for execution, hiding them in hospital wards under false names until they could be smuggled to safer locations. He sabotaged medical experiments by substituting harmless substances for deadly chemicals. He passed information to the resistance, maps and schedules and guard rotations that helped prisoners escape into the forests beyond the camp. And now, with the Allies approaching and the camp commanders growing paranoid, he was planning something bigger. He was planning to save as many women as possible before the SS could destroy the evidence of their crimes. He was planning to open the gates of hell and let the angels fly free. Liesel became Dr. Richter's shadow. She organized his files, memorized his contacts, learned the secret codes that allowed him to communicate with the resistance fighters hiding in the nearby villages. She watched him operate on women who should have died, his skilled hands defying the cruelty that surrounded them. She held the hands of prisoners as he removed tumors that the other doctors would have used as experiments, as he treated infections with medicine he had stolen from SS supply rooms, as he gave hope to women who had forgotten what hope felt like. She fell in love with him, not romantically, but with the pure, desperate love of someone who had finally found a reason to believe in humanity again. He was proof that goodness could survive even in the darkest places. He was proof that one person could make a difference. And when he asked her to help with his final plan, the plan that would either save hundreds of lives or end them both in the crematorium, she didn't hesitate. She said yes. She said yes because she had nothing left to lose. She said yes because every name she carried demanded it. She said yes because somewhere, in a world she might never see again, Tomasz was waiting for her to come home. The plan was simple in theory, complicated in execution. The SS was preparing to evacuate the camp before the Allies arrived. An evacuation meant death marches, endless walks through freezing forests, prisoners dropping from exhaustion and being shot where they fell. But the evacuation also meant chaos, confusion, guards more focused on escape than on counting prisoners. Dr. Richter had contacts in a nearby village, farmers and resistance fighters who had agreed to hide as many women as possible in barns and cellars until the Allies came. He had forged documents that identified certain prisoners as essential workers needed for a factory that didn't exist. He had bribed guards, stolen vehicles, memorized patrol schedules. And now, he needed Liesel to help him choose which women would be saved. It was an impossible task. How do you choose who lives and who dies? How do you look at 100 faces and pick 20 to survive? Liesel spent sleepless nights memorizing names, ages, skills, health conditions. She prioritized mothers with children, women with medical training who could help others, young girls like Eva who deserved a chance to live. She told herself she was being practical, that she couldn't save everyone, that these decisions were necessary. But every name she didn't choose felt like murder. Every face she passed over haunted her dreams. And when the day of the evacuation finally arrived, she wasn't sure if she was a hero or a monster. March 15th, 1945. The camp erupted in chaos. Guards shouted orders that contradicted each other. Prisoners were lined up, counted, separated into groups that seemed to have no logic. Trucks rolled through the gates, and women were loaded into them like cargo, their destinations unknown. Some were sent east, toward camps that no longer existed. Some were sent on foot into the forests, where they would walk until they died. And some, the lucky few, were herded toward Dr. Richter's medical building, where he had claimed to need them for a final round of disease prevention before transfer. There were 47 of them. Liesel knew each of their names by heart. She had chosen them over weeks of agonizing decisions. And now she stood in the medical building, watching Dr. Richter prepare the paperwork that would either save their lives or condemn them all. Outside, the sounds of evacuation continued, engines roaring, dogs barking, gunshots in the distance that meant someone else had tried to run. Inside, 47 women sat in silence, their eyes fixed on Liesel, their fate entirely in her hands. We leave in 1 hour, Dr. Richter said quietly. The trucks will take us to the western checkpoint. I've told the guards we're transporting contagious patients to a quarantine facility. They won't want to inspect us too closely. Liesel nodded, her hands trembling as she distributed the forged documents to each woman. The papers identified them as recovering typhus patients, too ill to march but too valuable to abandon. It was a thin lie, easily exposed if anyone looked too closely. But Dr. Richter had spent months building trust with the checkpoint guards, and he was gambling that their fear of disease would outweigh their suspicion. "What happens after the checkpoint?" asked a woman named Irina, a Polish nurse who had helped Liesel choose the final list. Dr. Richter looked at her with those kind eyes. "We disappear into the forest. My contacts have prepared hiding places in 3 different farms. You'll stay there until the Allies reach the area, a few weeks at most. After that, you'll be free." Free. The word hung in the air like a prayer. Liesel hadn't been free in 3 years. She had forgotten what it felt like. The trucks left at noon. Liesel sat in the back with 23 other women, her body pressed between Irina and a young French girl named Margot, who hadn't spoken since arriving at the camp. Dr. Richter drove the first truck, his SS uniform gleaming in the winter sun, his forged papers ready for inspection. The second truck carried the remaining women, driven by a guard who had been secretly working with the resistance since his brother was executed for desertion. The roads were clogged with military vehicles, with soldiers retreating from the advancing Allied forces, with prisoners being marched toward deaths they would never escape. No one paid attention to 2 medical trucks moving slowly toward the western checkpoint. The guard at the checkpoint was a young man with acne scars and frightened eyes. He glanced at Dr. Richter's papers, glanced at the women in the back of the truck, and waved them through without a second look. He was too scared to ask questions. He was too young to understand what he was allowing to pass. And just like that, 47 women drove through the gates of Ravensbrück and into the frozen German countryside. They drove for 3 hours, following back roads that wound through dense forests and abandoned villages. The sky was grey, the trees were bare, and snow covered everything in a blanket of white silence. Liesel watched through the slats of the truck, her heart pounding, waiting for the moment when guards would appear behind them, when gunshots would shatter the quiet, when everything would go wrong. But the road stayed empty, the forest stayed silent. And as the sun began to set, Dr. Richter pulled the truck off the road and into a clearing where 3 farmers waited with horses and wagons. "From here we walk," he said, climbing into the back of the truck to help the women down. "The farms are 2 miles through the forest. By morning, you'll be safe." Liesel's legs shook as she stepped onto solid ground. Her wooden shoes sank into the snow, and the cold bit through her thin uniform. But she barely noticed. She was outside the camp. She was breathing air that didn't smell like death. She was 2 miles away from safety, from freedom, from a future she had never dared to imagine. And then she heard the sound that changed everything. Dogs barking in the distance, guards' voices shouting orders, the crack of rifles being loaded. They had been followed. Dr. Richter's face went pale. "Run," he said. "All of you, run. Follow the farmers. They know the way." But the women were weak, their legs damaged by months of starvation and forced labor. They couldn't run. They could barely walk. Liesel looked at the 46 women she had chosen to save, at the terror in their eyes, at the hope that was already dying on their faces. And she made a decision. "Take them," she said to Irina. "Get them to the farms. I'll slow the guards down." Irina grabbed her arm. "You'll die." Liesel smiled, a sad, peaceful smile that she had learned from Eva. "Maybe, but they'll live, and that's enough." She turned and ran toward the sound of the dogs, her wooden shoes slipping on the ice, her breath burning in her chest. She didn't look back. She didn't want to see the faces of the women she was saving. She only wanted to give them time, a few minutes, an hour, whatever she could buy with her life. She had promised to carry their names into the future, and if she died here, in this frozen forest, at least she would die knowing that she had kept her promise. The guards found her within 10 minutes. 3 soldiers with rifles, 2 dogs with foam dripping from their jaws, and an officer whose face she recognized from the camp. He was the one who had pointed Eva to the right. He was the one who had sent countless women to the crematorium with nothing more than a flick of his finger. And now he stood before Liesel, his boots crunching on the frozen leaves, his eyes filled with a rage that seemed almost personal. "Where are the others?" he demanded. Liesel said nothing. The officer stepped closer, close enough that she could smell the cigarette smoke on his breath, the leather of his gloves, the death that clung to him like a second skin. "I asked you a question, Jew. Where are the other prisoners?" Liesel looked at him with eyes that held no fear. She had been afraid for 3 years. She had been terrified, desperate, broken in ways that would never heal. But standing here, in this frozen forest, with dogs straining at their leashes and rifles pointed at her chest, she felt something she hadn't expected. She felt peace. She had given everything she had. She had carried the names of the dead as far as she could. And now, finally, she could rest. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said calmly. "I was alone. I was trying to escape." The officer's hand moved so fast, she didn't see it coming. Pain exploded across her face, and she fell into the snow, tasting blood on her lips. He kicked her once, twice, 3 times, and she curled into a ball, protecting her head, waiting for the gunshot that would end everything. But the gunshot never came. Instead, the officer grabbed her hair and pulled her to her feet, his face inches from hers. "You're lying," he hissed. "Dr. Richter took 47 prisoners. We found his truck abandoned 2 miles from here. Where did they go?" Liesel's heart stopped. They knew about Dr. Richter. They knew about the escape. And now they were hunting not just for the women, but for the man who had saved them. "I don't know any Dr. Richter," she said. "I'm just a prisoner. Number 47,293. I know nothing." The officer studied her face for a long moment. Then he smiled. A cold, cruel smile that made her blood freeze. "We'll see about that." They dragged her back to Ravensbrück. The truck bounced over frozen roads, and Liesel lay on the metal floor, her body aching from the beating, her mind racing through possibilities. The women had at least an hour's head start. If they moved quickly, if the farmers knew what they were doing, they could be hidden before the guards organized a proper search. But Dr. Richter, what had happened to Dr. Richter? Had he escaped with the others? Had he been captured? Was he already dead, his body cooling in the snow, while his kind eyes stared at the sky? Liesel prayed to a God she wasn't sure she believed in anymore. She prayed for the women she had saved. She prayed for Dr. Richter, wherever he was. She prayed for Tomáš, still missing after all these years. She prayed for herself, not for survival, but for strength. The strength to keep silent, the strength to protect the people who had trusted her, the strength to die without betraying the only good thing she had ever done in this war. The interrogation lasted 3 days. They used water, electricity, beatings that left her unconscious. They asked about Dr. Richter, about the resistance contacts, about the locations of the hiding places. Liesl said nothing. She retreated into her mind, into the classroom in Jar, into the faces of 23 children who had believed that education could change the world. She recited multiplication tables in her head. She listed the capitals of every country in Europe. She remembered poems her mother had taught her, lullabies her father had sung, stories Tomáš had told about the horses he loved to draw. The pain was real, overwhelming, impossible to ignore, but it belonged to her body, and her body was just a vessel. Her mind was hers, her memories were hers, and no amount of torture could take them away. On the 4th day, they stopped asking questions. The officer came into her cell and looked at her with something that might have been respect. "It doesn't matter anymore," he said. "The war is over. Germany has lost. The Allies are in Berlin." Liesl tried to speak, but her lips were too swollen. He continued, his voice flat. "Richter escaped. The women escaped. You won." He pulled out his pistol and pointed it at her head. "But you won't live to see it." Liesl closed her eyes. She thought of Eva, smiling peacefully as she was led to the trucks. She thought of her mother, dying on the train with prayers on her lips. She thought of her father, falling into the mud with his hands reaching for his son. She thought of Tomáš, running toward the gap in the fence, his dark hair flying behind him. She had carried them all, every single one, for as long as she could. And now, finally, she could set them free. She heard the click of the pistol being cocked. She heard the officer's breathing, steady and calm. She heard, in the distance, the rumble of something that sounded almost like thunder. And then she heard a voice, a young voice, a familiar voice, shouting her name across the years. "Liesl! Liesl!" The officer spun around, and Liesl opened her eyes. Standing in the doorway of her cell, wearing the uniform of an American soldier, was a young man with dark hair and eyes the color of summer. A young man she had last seen running toward a gap in a fence. A young man who carried a sketchbook filled with drawings of horses. Her brother, Tomáš. The next few moments happened in fragments that Liesl would piece together later. Tomáš shouting in English, his voice commanding soldiers who appeared behind him like ghosts. The officer dropping his pistol, raising his hands, his face twisted with disbelief. Strong arms lifting Liesl from the concrete floor, carrying her into sunlight that burned her eyes after days in darkness. And then Tomáš's face, so close she could count the tears running down his cheeks, his hands touching her bruised face, as if afraid she would shatter. "I found you," he whispered. "I've been looking for 3 years, and I finally found you." Liesl wanted to speak, wanted to tell him everything, but her body had nothing left to give. She closed her eyes and let the darkness take her, knowing for the first time in 3 years that she was safe. Truly, completely safe. She woke in a hospital bed, in a room that smelled like soap and fresh linen, instead of death and decay. Tomáš sat beside her, holding her hand, his face pale with worry, but his eyes shining with joy. "The doctors say you'll recover," he said. "It will take time, but you'll be okay." Liesel looked at her brother, really looked at him, at the man he had become. He was 20 now, tall and lean, with their father's gentle hands and their mother's stubborn chin. He wore an American uniform that seemed too large for his thin frame, and there were scars on his neck that told stories she wasn't ready to hear. "How?" she croaked, her voice barely a whisper. "How are you alive? How are you here?" Tomasz squeezed her hand. "It's a long story, but you need to rest first." Liesel shook her head. She had waited 3 years for this story. She wasn't going to wait another minute. So Tomasz told her. The night he ran through the gap in the fence, he made it to a farmhouse 3 miles away. The farmer, an elderly woman named Mrs. Varga, hid him in her root cellar for 6 months while the Nazis searched the countryside. When the searchers stopped, she helped him escape to Hungary, where a network of resistance fighters smuggled him across borders until he reached Switzerland. He spent 2 years there, learning English, studying medicine, trying to find any information about his family. He learned that their mother had died on the train. He learned that their father had been shot in the street. But he could find no record of Liesel, no death certificate, no deportation papers, nothing. She had simply vanished. "I refuse to believe you were dead," he said, his voice cracking. "I knew you were alive somewhere. I knew you were fighting." When the Americans entered the war, Tomasz joined their army as a translator and intelligence officer. He spent 18 months interrogating German prisoners, gathering information about camp locations, searching for any trace of his sister. And 3 weeks ago, he intercepted a message about a failed escape from Ravensbrück, about a woman who had been recaptured and was being interrogated. The message mentioned her prisoner number, 47,2293. He had memorized that number from the transport lists he had studied. He knew it was her. "I led the raid myself," Tomasz said, his eyes fierce with pride. "I told my commanding officer it was strategic, that we needed to liberate the camp before the Nazis could destroy evidence. But really, I just needed to find you." Liesel felt tears streaming down her face, the first tears she had cried since Eva was taken away. "Mama and Papa," she whispered. "They're really gone." Tomasz nodded, his own tears falling freely. "But we're still here. We survived. And as long as one of us remembers them, they're not really gone. They live in us." Liesel thought of all the names she had carried through the darkness, her parents, her brother, Eva, Marta, the 47 women she had helped save, the countless others she had taught in the bunks at night. She had promised to carry them into the future. And now, finally, she could begin to set them free. She reached for Tomasz's hand and held it tight, feeling the warmth of his skin, the strength of his grip. "Tell me about your drawings," she said softly. "Tell me you still draw horses." Tomasz laughed, a real laugh, the laugh of the boy who had sketched horses in the fields beyond Jar. "I do," he said. "I draw them every day. They remind me of home." And for the first time in 3 years, Liesel smiled. The next few weeks were a blur of recovery and reunion. Tomasz brought her news from the outside world. Germany had surrendered. The war in Europe was over. Allied forces were liberating camps and documenting the horrors they found. He brought her news of Dr. Richter, who had survived and was now working with American medical teams to treat the survivors of Ravensbrück. he brought her news of the 46 women she had helped save, all alive, all recovering in farms and hospitals across the region. And he brought her one final piece of news that made her heart stop. Irina, the Polish nurse who had led the women to safety, wanted to see her. "She's here," Liesel asked, her voice trembling. "In this hospital." Tomasz smiled. "She refused to leave until she could thank you in person." That afternoon, Liesel sat up in bed for the first time and watched as Irina walked through the door. The nurse looked different now, healthier, stronger, with color in her cheeks and light in her eyes. She crossed the room in 3 steps and pulled Liesel into an embrace that said everything words could not. "You saved us," Irina whispered. "You ran toward the dogs so we could escape. You let them capture you so we could live. How can I ever thank you?" Liesel held her close and breathed in the scent of life, of hope, of a future that was finally beginning to unfold. 1 year later, Liesel Moravec stood at the front of a classroom in New York City, pointing at a map of Europe with a wooden stick. 23 children sat before her, their eyes bright with curiosity, their notebooks open and ready. They were the children of refugees, Jewish, Polish, Czech, Hungarian, families who had survived the war and crossed the ocean to build new lives in America. And Liesel was their teacher, just as she had always been meant to be. The scars on her body had faded, but not disappeared. The nightmares still came some nights, waking her screaming, sending her running to the window to make sure the electric fences weren't waiting outside. But every morning, she put on her best dress, brushed her hair with her mother's silver brush, and walked to the school where children were waiting to learn. She taught them mathematics and history and poetry. She taught them the capitals of countries that had been destroyed and rebuilt, the names of rivers that still flowed to oceans, the stories of people who had survived impossible darkness and found their way back to light. She taught them that knowledge was power, that education was resistance, that every child, no matter how wounded, could change the world. Dr. Karl Richter had moved to America too, opening a clinic in Brooklyn that specialized in treating survivors of the camps. He and Liesel met for coffee every Sunday morning, sharing stories of the patients they were helping, the lives they were rebuilding, the future they were creating from the ashes of the past. He never talked about what he had done in Ravensbrück, the risks he had taken, the lives he had saved, the courage that had seemed so ordinary at the time. But Liesel knew. She remembered, and she made sure that his story was told alongside all the others, that his name was added to the list she carried in her heart. The 46 women she had helped save scattered across the world, to Israel, to Australia, to small towns in America and Canada, where they raised families and planted gardens and taught their children about the night they escaped through a frozen forest. Every year, on March 15th, they gathered somewhere new to remember. They called it Liberation Day, and they celebrated with food and music and stories that made them laugh and cry at the same time. Liesel attended every single gathering. She hugged every single woman. She told them, again and again, that they had saved her as much as she had saved them. Tomasz married an American nurse named Elizabeth and became a surgeon at a hospital in Manhattan. He and Liesel lived 3 blocks apart, close enough to share Sunday dinners and holiday celebrations, close enough to hold each other when the memories became too heavy to carry alone. He still drew horses, beautiful, wild horses that galloped across sketchbook pages and hung on the walls of his apartment. But he also drew other things now. Portraits of their parents based on the photographs Liesl had saved, scenes from their childhood in Jar, images of a village that no longer existed except in their memories. Sometimes, late at night, Liesl would sit in his studio and watch him work, and she would see their father's gentle hands in the way Tomáš held his pencil, hear their mother's lullabies in the scratch of charcoal on paper. Their family had been destroyed by hatred, but it had not been erased. It lived on in two survivors who refused to forget, who carried the names of the dead into a future that had once seemed impossible. And every time Liesl looked at her brother's drawings, she felt her parents and her mother beside them, smiling from somewhere just beyond the canvas. The letter arrived on a Tuesday in October, exactly 7 years after Liesl had first entered Ravensbrück. It was from a woman named Hannah Weiss, a survivor of the camp who had heard Liesl's story from one of the nurses she had saved. Hannah had a daughter, a 15-year-old girl who dreamed of becoming a teacher. The girl's name was Ava. Hannah had named her after a friend who had died in the camp, a girl who had been too weak to survive the selection, but too brave to give up hope. Liesl read the letter with tears streaming down her face, her hands trembling on the paper. The Ava she had known was gone, taken by the cruelty of a world that had lost its way. But this new Ava, this living, breathing, dreaming Ava, was proof that the names Liesl carried had not been forgotten. They had been planted like seeds in the hearts of survivors, growing into new lives that would carry them forward for generations. That afternoon, Liesl wrote back to Hannah Weiss. She invited young Ava to visit her classroom, to sit in the front row where the first Eva might have sat, to learn about mathematics and history and poetry from a teacher who understood what it meant to survive. The classroom fell silent as Liesl finished her story. 23 children stared at her, their eyes wide, their notebooks forgotten on their desks. She had never told them about the camp before, never explained the numbers tattooed on her forearm, never revealed the scars hidden beneath her sleeves. But today was different. Today was March 15th, Liberation Day, and Hannah Weiss's daughter sat in the front row with a notebook full of questions and a heart full of dreams. Some of you have parents who survived terrible things, Liesl said softly. Some of you carry names that should never be forgotten. I want you to know that carrying those names is not a burden. It is a gift. It means you are connected to people who fought for their lives, who refused to let darkness win, who believed that the future was worth fighting for. You are their future. You are the proof that they survived. She paused, looking at each child in turn, seeing the faces of everyone she had ever loved reflected in their innocent eyes. And as long as you remember them, they will never truly be gone. The bell rang, but no one moved. Ava Weiss, the new Ava, the living Ava, raised her hand slowly. Miss Moravec, she asked, will you teach me to be brave like you? Liesl smiled, and for a moment she was 22 again, standing in a classroom in Jar, believing that education could change the world. I'll teach you something better, she said. I'll teach you that you already are.